touch each other, please. They go right down deep, and they have collided. So both the BWT cars collide.
So it's an inside squabble between the two Williams. Looked to me like Rosberg tapped the back of Webber. That is absolutely the last thing any Formula One team wants to see.
That's a Lacey and Heidfeld. I don't know what's happened, but it's the they pour out across as if he hadn't got enough pressure on him.
Oh, we've lost a wheel. It's a racing engineering car that's ripped his left wheel off. Furious at his teammate. That will be a very fun team briefing.
Hello and a good day to everyone. This is Teammate Collision, the official GPRejects.com podcast. I am your host, Lennart, a column writer for GP Rejects, author of the monthly Gravel Trap, and I am joined, as usual, by Jeremy, the author of pretty much everything else on our side. How are you?
Hello there. My name is Jeremy. I'm author of the race reports, usually when we do them after our Grand Prix, all 29 of them this year. And then the driver profiles these days as well, though we do have our guests as well, who write in frequently for us, and you're always welcome to join us, dear listener, if you have a topic idea that you want to bring up. We're not a closed shop here at GP Rejects, but I'm doing fine. It's double digits here for the first time of the year here in Helsinki. How's it going over there where you are, Lennart?
Yeah, we're slowly starting to get into something that resembles spring. Like, we also just barely entered the double digits over here in northern Germany, and yeah, let's hope it stays that way for a bit. It's been cold for long enough, I'd say.
And it has been long enough as well since we've last done a podcast. It's been about nearly 3 months or so. We're making these rather infrequently these days, but whenever we do, we have a topic to talk about.
Indeed. But before we get to that topic, we obviously need to talk about the big news in Formula One. And I mean the big news. After all, the FIA is currently looking into the process of perhaps allowing a new team to enter Formula One, and a challenger has emerged that absolutely cannot be ignored.
But this is Andretti you're talking about, surely?
Oh, no. Compared to Andretti, this is a whole nother level of franchise value we're talking here.
What, is Rich Energy joining?
Not quite that energy. Not quite that franchise valuable. But the Saudi government is sponsoring an effort by former Formula One team boss Greg Pillock to... I actually said Greg Pillock. Greg Pollock.
That's staying in.
No, it isn't.
That's staying in.
Greg Pollock to enter a new team into Formula One with the explicit premise of having or at least planning to have an equal amount of staff from both genders, as in men or women, obviously. And obviously, you can almost smell the franchise value coming up from that, wouldn't you say?
Are you trying to say that they are trying to circumvent the closed shop of Formula One by appealing to the franchise value and appealing to the lowest common denominator values of cheap marketing gimmicks just to get into Formula One?
Obviously, I would never imply such a thing. I am fully committed to believing their belief in the value of the equality of genders, especially given as Saudi Arabia is, after all, a country that values the rights of men and women alike. So I do not know how you could be cynical about that.
Now, it's funny you should mention that, Lennart, because I happened to completely and independently, coincidentally, read an article in the news a few weeks back that said that Aramco, which is run by the Saudi Arabian government, made a $110 billion profit in 2021 and then a $161 billion profit last year. And the Saudis, in some form or another, have been, let's say, sneaking around the edges of Formula One, perhaps looking to put a stake in buying it. Mohammed bin Sulayem, in fact, famously got into a little bit of trouble for talking about the value of the sport itself, of the series, I should say.
Well,
But I'm sure this is a total coincidence.
oh, for sure it is. I mean, again, it is one thing to want to buy Formula One and to get involved in it, but it's another to just do their part for the equality of genders in the world. So I don't think these two things have any connection. That'd be ridiculous.
So this project's called Formula Equal, and the idea is to have it 50-50 split on like everything. Like how far does it extend, like the gender split?
Well, yeah, the idea is pretty much to have everything be equal. The implication would obviously also be that this would be the pathway to the first female racing driver in... Actually, let me think about it. I know it was 1992, but I don't actually remember how many years 1992 was back.
Longer for some of us, clearly. 31 years since this year. But I'm guessing that this would be for the 2026 entry, same as Andretti was looking towards.
Yes, that is the plan, to obviously become part of the current FIA process to perhaps allow new teams to enter. The entry period is now. According to a recent article, Zach Brown expects 4 serious candidates to enter final consideration, but obviously that's just his guess. But I, for one, can obviously only speak for myself and the gravel trap, which is my column, in saying that
Nice.
I obviously am fully behind this new team. I fully support the Saudi team of diversity. STD for short.
That's very noble of you to support the STDs. But that's it. It's very noble of Zach Brown to allow 4 teams to participate in the audition so that he could reject all of them. Though as far as I'm aware, that Zach Brown is actually one of the more accepting people in terms of the team principles. And by more accepting, I mean, I don't think he is personally pushing for the entry fee to be increased to $600 million or euros, which some have said that it may be increased to that.
We could be cynical and point out that those $600 million dollar numbers came mostly from bottom feeder teams, but that'd be mean, so we won't. Which we did by saying we won't. Parallipsis.
It goes without saying, so we'll say it anyway. But yeah, with Aramco making $161 billion profit last year, it 600 million even wouldn't be a very heavy dent in that profit if they chose to go ahead making their own Formula One team. But yeah, I expect this will probably fizzle out within the next couple of weeks, or we'll never hear it again, which will make this podcast both interesting in its anachronism and also completely, totally pointless.
Or in the ideal scenario, we hear from them and have a future profile almost guaranteed, because yeah.
And what do you mean by that? Are you trying to say that? Well, okay. To be fair, with a budget that they would have, then like they would, even if they were a Toyota, surely they would at least do semi-decently.
Well, yes, obviously, I didn't mean the team would fail. That is ridiculous. And after all, I always believe in STDs. But the thing is, obviously, in the first years, new teams tend to struggle a bit, and the drivers driving for them tend to struggle a bit. So we could get possibly an unlucky reject profile out of this. Not of the team, of course. That is completely off the charts. But if a driver or two may get unlucky, and we might get some new content.
Yeah, well, at least there's some hope for us down the line.
Indeed.
Not much, but there's some.
And what is life if not keeping up hope? Anyway, speaking of Greg Pollock, I got it right this time.
Well done.
Thank you. Let's get to the actual topic of today's podcast, and that is the one of the seasons many Formula One fans have very positive memories of and have very positive feeling towards, the 2003 season.
Indeed. Much like with our pilot episode for 2012, we're doing a season review of 2003, which I personally was about 6 years old when it happened, but in my years of following this sport far too closely, I went back and many years ago, watched through the whole season, and we are going to go through we are going to go through our opinions on the season. We're going to go through the events, I suppose, especially the rejectful ones, what occurred, and we're going to more specifically go through our old overlords' opinions. That being Jamie and Enoch, who ran the old F1 Rejects website, who invented the Reject of the Race and Reject of the Year as such awards.
And really the concept of reject as a whole.
Indeed, yes. I should give them even more credit than I just did, but yes. Basically, the reason why Lennart and I are here in the first place. And we want, 20 years later, to do a little bit of hindsight, because their way of doing rejects of the year, of the decade, of the race, however they did it, was usually through expectations. And the expectations were always built up at the beginning of the season, and they were relatively strongly principled in the idea that they would predict who they thought was going to do well, who was going to do badly, and as a result, at the year end, they could try to pick their reject of the year, who was the worst, judging by what they expected. So it wasn't always the worst performer, it wasn't always the guy who came last. It was who was that was what a reject was. It was who performed worst related to expectations. Or who was just really bad. It did also sometimes just be someone who was really bad. But in general, we now have hindsight, and we can look back at 2003 with a different viewing to how they did, just like we did with 2012. That's why we're here today. We're going to talk about 2003, which was a crazy season. It's hard to say who didn't have at least some rejectable performances, and I'm sure we'll get into it pretty shortly.
Indeed. Though, on the topic of hindsight, it is worth noting that I would imagine when Janoc wrote the old profiles, they certainly did not expect two drivers of that field, and in fact two drivers in the top 6 of the standings, to actually still compete in the 2021 Formula 1 season, and one of them to even compete in the 2023 Formula 1 season.
That's absolutely bonkers to think about. When you imagine that someone like, was it Riccardo Patrese, I think, for a long time held the starts record, and he was in from 77 to 93, which is 16 years in Formula 1, which is absolutely ludicrous. And then you consider Rubens Barrichello, who was, 19, 18 seasons? And now we have Fernando Alonso, who's just blasting out the all-time race record.
And is apparently in no hurry to stop with doing that, so...
No, and good on him. But I guess 2003 is where his career really started. Maybe we could begin with Alonso. Do you want to start there?
Yeah, it's as good a start as good a place to start as anywhere, because in fact, on the old F1Rejects.com website, he was the best driver of the year. And
this is a very good place to start then.
Yeah, and honestly, it is not an assessment I would very much disagree with. Like, would I outright say him as number one? Perhaps not, but he would certainly be in the discussion, and on the podium he'd be featured for sure. I can't say back then, the kid. He got in to the Renault after a year of testing. Was pretty much on par from day one, was in contention for his first Grand Prix win at the very second race. In fact, the debut win of Kimi Räikkönen, we'll get to him. And pretty much kept up great performances from then on to his seemingly inevitable first career win at the Hungarian Grand Prix, where he completely dominated the race. So, there were only 2 marks against him, which were consecutive DNFs in France and the British Grand Prix, as well as in the last 2 races of the season. But, well, being too critical about that is unnecessarily negative, I'd say.
Alonso is interesting, yeah, because he had, for context, he had a year in Minardi, where he did pretty well. He was pretty highly rated, but he was very young. Did a year as a test driver for Renault, and then got bumped up to the main race in 2003 if I'm not mistaken, in replacement of Jenson Button, actually, originally. And it's interesting, like, early Alonso was very, very fast, but he was also very young. And it's interesting to watch future world champions and people of the level of people like Vettel or Alonso when they were in their early stages, like when they just made it to the big scene. Because in 2003, Alonso was very good. He wasn't perfect, but he was very good. And you can just see, especially from his pole lap at Malaysia, his win at Hungary, he really took the scene by storm. And one of the main reasons for that was not just that he was a bright young face, it was that he was breaking basically every youth record there was. And many of those youth records, although we definitely, at least Lennart and I, you and I have both sort of lived through the time when the youth record got broken every 2 or 3 years by someone younger would keep coming in. And so it maybe it doesn't mean very much anymore if someone's, the youngest to do this, because it's like, yeah, there's always someone younger. But Alonso was only 21, 22 in 2003, which is still absurdly young. When he began in Minardi, he was 19. So although he's still racing 20 years after 2003, it's, he did have a good age start to go with that. But.
Certainly. One of the things I found fascinating, because obviously in preparation for this podcast, I went back to look at a few races I did not have the complete memory of. You could pretty much always hear James Allen going over how he talked with Pat Simmons about Fernando Alonso and how he was like Michael Schumacher, a young Michael Schumacher that is, and even completely leaving out everything that happened after this season, it was still not a comparison that seemed odd or overhyped. So he really was living up to the hype pretty much from day one in Renault, and now we're ending up with a situation where F1 Rejects placed him first in 2003, and would they exist, and assuming the early season form in 2023 holds, he could be placed first in 2023. So it cannot be
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, it cannot be overstated. Regardless of what else you want to say about the man, but as a driver and in terms of all-time consistency, he's right up there at the absolute top of the list.
Yeah, I mean, 2 years ago when we started these podcasts, I think we were a little bit funny about like, he's not doing too badly, because we started mid 2021, and now I like how we've developed it to like, nope, he's the best. It's just like, if he's getting, we're dating this podcast by talking about early 2023, but like in the first 3 races of the year, at this point in recording, he's just scored 3 third places in a row. So it's like, it's a better start to the season than he had in 2003.
Yeah, in a way.
When he got his first ever pole.
And the thing is, again, obviously this could just, as you said, date the entire thing when if he hypothetically starts falling off, or Lance Stroll proceeds to kick his ass now that he's completely healed, I hope. But, as in I hope he's healed, not the other part. But obviously it is just amazing, and especially now that we are looking at 2003 in hindsight, you can see the star he was destined to become, and, well, in a way, even the all-time legend he was to become, but what we actually got is insane.
From James Allen gushing to us gushing, one thing that I find is interesting is that when he got a podium in Malaysia after his pole position, he was the youngest podium sitter of all time at that point. And now he's only the 8th youngest in 20 years. So 7 younger drivers have sat on the podium to him. He was the youngest leader of any race, same race. Now he's the 5th youngest ever. But one interesting thing, his youngest pole sitter record from Malaysia was not actually beaten by Max Verstappen. Max Verstappen didn't actually get his own pole position until he was actually older than Fernando Alonso was. I find that quite interesting, seeing how young Verstappen was in good machinery for such a long time.
Yeah, but for some reason on Saturday it never seemed to come together, and yeah. it is what it is sometimes. But obviously,
Yep.
Max holds every other relevant youngest to ever thing. I think except world champion also as well. But outside of that, he has got so many youngest ever awards. He can share a couple.
Yeah, and one interesting thing is that 2004 especially, I think, really showed that Alonso wasn't perfect. 2003 did as well, but his hype was so strong that it negated the bad mistakes that he made, because he did have that really dodgy crash in Monza, if I'm not mistaken, in 2003, which was entirely of his own doing because he qualified poorly, and it was right after he'd also won the race in Hungary, and he didn't have a perfect season. Spoilers, nobody did. But Alonso was still rough around the edges, but he was riding the wave. Or riding the whirlwind from the moment he sat down in that Renault. So I might disagree that he was the best driver of 2003, but I couldn't easily name you a successor to that position. So.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you look at drives like Spain, the one night we actually haven't mentioned yet, where he was just as likely to take his first win, almost even more so than Malaysia. Like in Malaysia, his rather low fuel load meant he wasn't quite as much in contention as he was in Spain, where he only lost it in the final round of pit stops because he got stuck behind Ralph Schumacher for a bit. But yeah, in the early stages, it was very easy to ignore what he when he had his missteps, because the non-missteps were so great that you thought, okay, yeah, youthful folly, who cares? He's so good.
Yes, it's very forgivable. Just like Sebastian Vettel was in 2008 and 2009, he was riding that whirlwind of young driver hype, where he was so damn good that you could forgive his stupid mistakes, and like Vettel, he ironed them out pretty quickly by about the mid-2000s. One thing which I guess we can maybe segue into the next topic is that he actually got his, this is Fernando Alonso I'm talking about, got his first pole position before Kimi Räikkönen did, in spite of the fact that Kimi Räikkönen was in, you could debate if 2002 McLaren was race-winning machinery, but he was in damn decent machinery.
Let's call it pole level machinery.
Yeah, I would say that's fair.
After all, David Coulthard insists he's the only one who beat Michael Schumacher fair and square in 2002, so... Or Michael Schumacher and Ferrari. But, yeah, we'll get to DC later.
We'll get to DC. But it's interesting because, like, we also don't associate Michael Schumacher with being a pole specialist. If I'm not mistaken, he didn't beat Senna's record, which, let's face it, he beat the record because he was just in top machinery for a longer period of time.
Yeah, pretty much. He got his the record-breaking pole at Imola in 2006. So
2006, yeah. And we wouldn't consider Schumacher a pole specialist, which makes it doubly interesting that Räikkönen didn't get his first pole until Nürburgring in 2003, which was midway through the season. I find that interesting because Räikkönen is generally considered, some people, not me, consider 2003 to be Räikkönen's best season. He was, again, very young, only about a year or two older than Alonso. He was young, good-looking, had frosted tips, haircut, and was very fast. And most importantly, to get everyone on his side, he wasn't Michael Schumacher, which tended to help to get people popular. He still had his Iceman aesthetic, which was definitely developing at that time.
But hadn't quite fully grown to be the embarrassment it would become later, but...
you had to say that.
I had to say that.
But... So, 2003 is interesting for Räikkönen. He almost won the season. He had some incredible runs. But I'm going to be overly critical in hindsight. I think something like 2005 was a much stronger year for Räikkönen. I think 2003, just like Fernando Alonso, he was so early in his career, he made too many mistakes. I think the reason why he lost the championship wasn't because Schumacher was so far ahead in terms of the Ferrari, but because of Räikkönen's own mistakes. I hope you can balance me out here, because I'm usually negative about Räikkönen. But I'm thinking, for example, the Spanish Grand Prix, where he crashed in qualifying, started last and immediately crashed into the back of, if I'm not mistaken, it was Pitsonia. Or it was one of the Jaguars.
It was Pitsonia.
And Schumacher, who was fighting him for the championship, won the race from pole. And it's like, well, Spain is supposed to be an easy track, low stress, low attrition, so to speak, and low drama. And Raikkonen he was clearly the young pretender, so to speak, to Schumacher, as he was basically touted. But to me, he didn't quite have it. He crashed, if I'm not mistaken, also at the German Grand Prix, which was, he got himself involved in a first lap collision and he lost lots of points. So for that reason, I wouldn't say that Raikkonen was the best of the year. But I'd like you to maybe disagree with me, if you can.
Well,
what Raikkonen's best moments of 2003 were.
Well, I actually am going to partially disagree with you, which, knowing my opinion on Kimi Raikkonen, is still saying something. So, mind you, in fairness, I never actually was hostile to him as a driver because his talent was undeniable. It was always pretty much everything else that's the problem. But let's get back to 2003. And first of all, I want to stress that I fully agree with the notion that both his crashes in Spain and Germany were not helpful. In fact, I'm even harsher on you as far as the crash in the German Grand Prix goes, because this is something that someone over a certain experience level doesn't do. To remind people who haven't seen the crash in a while, the thing is, Rubens Barrichello had a bad start at the Grand Prix, and obviously everyone wanted to get by him, slow Ferrari and everything. But the thing is, Kimi placed himself in a situation so far on the outside of the track that unless everything went absolutely perfectly, he would have gotten wiped out, which he eventually did, taking Ralph with him. Ralph Schumacher, that is. We actually need to clarify that because we have two Ralphs this season in 2003.
With two Ralphs and two Schumachers.
Yeah. The thing is, so that was pretty much completely avoidable, but I think I'm going to disagree with you in regards to the machinery he had. We have to remember that while the season was more equal than a lot, and McLaren had a great car to start the year with, it was pretty clear that they were not quite on the level of the Ferrari or the BMW Williams. So in many ways it was Kimi doing the best he could to sensibly collect points. Like, if we're talking about youthful follies, then you would have expected something like Monaco to go wrong, where he was pretty much on the back of Juan Pablo Montoya the entire final stage of the race, and neither one of them ended in the barrier. So I think while he did have a number of mistakes that ended up costing him the championship, I also think it's somewhat similar remotely to... No, actually, scratch that. The comparison doesn't actually fit, so I'm not going to make it. The thing is, in the end, while he wasn't ready to be a champion yet in a way, the thing is, his performance is still impressive, that I would say he had a very good season, and it's not like if I imagine someone else in that McLaren, like anyone realistically, like obviously if I'm going to take 80s pros and put him in that McLaren, he probably wins the championship, but we don't have 80s pros in 2003. So, but from the realistically options, I don't think anyone could have done better in that McLaren. So to say, or let's put it that way, if you do the best you can in that car and be the best who can do it in that car, then I say that's a season very much worthy of a gold star. So yeah, he was... I can quickly redirect to the Formula 1 Rejects.com ranking to sort of agree with me here, because Kimi was placed second, and as he was in the championship, so runners up everywhere, which fits because he had, after all, a whole 7 second places this in the 2003 season.
7 seconds is a lot of seconds. Who does he think he is, Esteban Ocon?
Yeah, evidently it does. And, well, obviously, probably wouldn't have made it to second in Spain, but who knows, if he hadn't crashed out, he could have at least had 5 seconds places in a row, which would have been a Formula 1 record, actually would still be one, but ifs and buts.
Yeah, so it's interesting that Raikkonen only won one race that year. Thank you, by the way, for defending him against me.
Yeah.
It's
He can thank me.
he only won one race in a year where he fought for the championship, which is also very unusual in modern times. He and Alonso both won their first races. They both only won one race, and the other driver who won the first race that year was Giancarlo Fisichella, who maybe we could jump onto next.
Yeah, Fisichella, obviously the Cinderella story of 2003, the infamous Brazilian Grand Prix. Remember when brain races were a thing? God, I miss him.
Yeah, that really does show the sign of the times, doesn't it? they raced, if I'm not mistaken, over 75% of the distance of that race in torrential rain.
We all remember the famous Curva do Sol, where, ironically, that name, by the way, where a number of cars just straight up skirted into the wall without any chance of saving themselves, up to and including Michael Schumacher. And we all know when the Regenmeister aquaplanes into a wall, well, yeah, situation's still difficult.
So the context is that the third round of the year was Interlagos, and it was Interlagos was a good name for the track because it poured down with rain, and they really hadn't got the channeling of the water right. So basically, all the water from the grandstands and from the top of the hill was all going into the Curva del Sol. So basically, everyone who went in there crashed. There's a very funny picture which we could even use as the thumbnail for this podcast maybe, which is the car park of cars of I think it was Jenson Button, of Michael Schumacher, and many others who all crashed at that same corner because there was no runoff for the water except for into the grass itself. So any touch with the water, you were off and you were not getting back. And
we can give
yeah.
We can give a quick shout out to one of our users in the GPR Discord, Vazel, who famously called it the Curva do Lel, which
Curva do Lel, which is it's about right. It was a great race. It's one of the best races of that year, of a year which had nothing but good races basically. And it was stopped early due to a crash. If I'm not mistaken, Webber crashed first, and Alonso, who came out into the final corner unsighted, crashed into the wreckage of Webber's car. It was such a heavy crash that most of Alonso's monocoque was blasted off, wheels everywhere, and he was sent to hospital, so he didn't actually see the podium, which he inherited from that. Race was stopped. A lot of controversy about when it was supposed to be stopped. Who was it? Was it Raikkonen who was second, who was perhaps going to take the win? I think he was originally credited with the win, but then it was stripped of him.
He had taken the lead on that lap, if I recall correctly, and so he was declared the winner. But obviously that was reversed later. But at the time he had the whole podium ceremony with him standing up there, raising the trophy and everything. And then they had to arrange a rather amusing scenario ahead of the San Marino Grand Prix, which unfortunately was one of the very few amusing things that weekend, where Kimi had to where Kimi handed the trophy over to Fisichella and Jordan, which, yeah, was a pretty funny story at the time and has only gotten funnier in hindsight.
It's a bit bizarre, yeah. Jordan, who did not have a good season that year, we could get into that as well. They basically had to fight for a win, which was deservedly theirs, because the red flag rules are that I think it's 2 laps back, which was just enough for it to be classified as a 75% race. But there's all sorts of other stories about their race. Like for example, Jos Verstappen almost won it if he had not pitted. Basically, the idea was that they had Minardi had sent him in for an extra bit of fuel to bump into the end of the race, but they actually had fuel in the car. So if they hadn't had pitted him, in hindsight, if they'd known in advance that the red flag was going to come out, Jos Verstappen and Minardi would have won the race. So yeah, like it's a crazy race, and if you haven't seen it, then you have to.
If I recall the story a bit differently. I think the thing is
maybe I'm misremembering.
Could be, or I could be wrong, but I recall the story that he was fueled to the end and was ahead of Fisichella when he simply spun off into turn 1.
Oh, that's it. That's the story. That's it. That's exactly what it is. Shit. Yeah.
So who knows what that could have altered had that come to pass? Perhaps he would have less of a desire to, well, how do I say this without getting us a slander lawsuit? Be strict with his son if he had himself gotten a Grand Prix win. But who knows?
Moving swiftly on, Jordan Fisichella's team had probably their first really, really bad season, and 2002, 2003 was about the turning point or so for Jordan when they started going from a really punching above their weight midfield team to a backmarker team, and they did not recover. Eddie Jordan's interest in the sport started to wane quite heavily. The win for them in Interlagos is it's an enigma. It's a very bizarre result, but it's a win. It's a win like any other. So you could say that Jordan won as many races as Kimi Räikkönen did that year.
The thing is, with Jordan, it's actually a very interesting development because at the beginning of the year, like they were obviously lower midfield, but they weren't completely off the pace back markers. They just completely lost touch in the development race, probably because they started to really feel the lack of money. But at the start of the season, you could easily see them hanging up there with the other teams, like Ralph Firman. We'll get to him in a second. Took his only Formula 1 point at Spain, and that was, while obviously helped with a bit of things going wrong for other teams, was generally speaking on merit. So it was not like Jordan, where like they would be in 2004 and especially 2005, and the iterations at Mid-Atlantic Spikers straight pretty much parked at the back of the grid and no hopers from day one. It's just that they completely lost their edge in the development race because of lacking money, not good personnel that wasn't up to the task. Probably both.
Yeah, it's a dark side of that season, which connects quite heavily to the present day, which is that there was a consolidation, especially from the larger manufacturer teams, with this is the time period which, if you don't know about this was heavily escalating costs. There were basically the big teams had testing mileage, they had the resources far beyond what the teams, most of the back markers did, the privateers, not to mention the teams today, in terms of the budgets that they were providing. Toyota famously, in one of their mid-2000 seasons, had like twice the budget of a current Formula 1 team, and they finished 5th overall. That's the kind of budget we're talking about. And Eddie Jordan especially was one of the people, not to mention Paul Stoddart a few years further down the line, who very much lost touch with Formula 1 over the years and became quite disillusioned. Lots of decisions were made in back rooms, in courtrooms, which is also not necessarily unique to that period of Formula 1 history, but it was definitely a changing of the guard, I would say, and the downfall of Jordan is probably quite representative of that. And if I may continue, we didn't introduce 2003 very much, but it was the last season which had 16 races in it. No season since then has had 16. The closest is 2009, which had 17 with a half points race in Malaysia, and then 2020, which had 17, and that was with a truncated 6-month race, which they still managed to jump 17 races in. It's hard to believe now that the 2003 season actually ended in October in early October of that year.
And modern F1 fans complain about the length of the off-season now.
Yeah. And furthermore, if you imagine that Michael Schumacher at the time had won the championship the previous July. So the length of time between deciding championships was a year and 3 months, which is, again, it's kind of bananas to think about these days.
There was a ridiculous stat James Allen mentioned during the Australian Grand Prix, which obviously was won by David Coulthard. Again, we'll get to them. But the thing is, he mentioned that at the time, that was during the point where Michael Schumacher had either lost the lead or was still in it. No, wait, this was after he had the skirts of his car fell off, and he made an additional pit stop because of that. And then James Allen mentioned that this would be the first time, assuming at the time Raikkonen was leading, if Raikkonen won that race, it would be the first time that someone other than Michael Schumacher would have led the championship since, I don't recall the exact date, but it was something in 2000, as in the year
United
2000.
States, yeah, the United States Grand Prix 2000, when Mika Häkkinen led the championship.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane to think about. So, and in many ways, that is also the context that is necessary to remember, because one thing we also didn't introduce much yet is the thing that 2003 also featured a number of rule changes, like
yes.
a very large number.
Yes. There was a new point system which rewarded people who finished in worst positions. Went down to 8th. This was intended to stop Schumacher from winning. It nearly did, considering how many second places Kimi Räikkönen picked up.
It also reduced the margin from first to second by 2 points.
Again, for context, Schumacher entered 2003 with 19 consecutive podiums behind him, which is a lot of podiums. Not even Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes have managed to equal that, which tells you what you need to know about Michael Schumacher, I think. And maybe a little bit Ferrari. Maybe a little bit of Ferrari.
Well, the Ferrari Michael had, in a way, created by taking all of 90s Benetton stuff with him. Because if it says Ferrari on the marquee, but it's not Ferrari, then you have good Ferrari.
True. Whatever rule changes were there was the qualifying change, whereby now people would be doing 1 lap qualifying. This would, of course, benefit those drivers who were more towards, how should I say, the 1 lap specialists, not those who were able to put in the practice time and get a good lap over a period of time, aka people like Michael Schumacher. So there was that change.
Plus, of course, the qualifying was with race fuel now, a trend that would pretty much, after that, last throughout the entire period of the refueling rule itself existing. They didn't cancel that until 2010.
Yeah, it was a good rule, actually. I particularly like the qualifying on race fuel because it does provide at least a little bit of variety. As shown in 2009, for example, it does provide variety for where people qualify, not just on the pace of their car, but on their strategy itself.
So you especially saw that especially in the early part of 2003, where people had not yet adapted to that rule and weren't quite sure what was grid position worth versus having fuel in the race, which led to a very mixed up grid, especially in the first couple of races. Obviously, by the later part of the season, they got these things down more a bit and the grid normalized a bit, so that's the one quote-unquote issue with race fuel qualifying, that eventually teams adapt to it. But
yeah, that's how it goes.
But the thing is, even then, the 1 lap and race fuel combination led to some interesting scenarios. We talked about Kimi's crash in Spain. You have to remember, the only reason he was in a position to crash in Pitsonia, who wasn't near the front very often, to put it that way. We'll get to him. I think I said that for the 5th time now. Is because he was heavy and he made a mistake in Saturday qualifying, where he took a small trip off the track and obviously found himself very much down the order.
From qualifying, we then had the testing. So there was an effort to allow the smaller teams to test more at the race weekends, trying to counteract the fact that Ferrari were doing huge amounts of testing at their own Fiorano track. Again, for context, Luca Badoer, sadly most well known for his 2009 exploits in Ferrari, was their test driver throughout the mid to late 2000s all the way to the late 2000s. By 2004, he had done 87,000 kilometers of testing for Ferrari.
I'm going to have to calculate now how much that is in F1 race distances.
It's probably a lot.
What was the number again?
87,000 kilometers.
Well, by assuming it is, we are following the standard Formula 1 rule that a race is 305 kilometers, we're talking about 255 race distances.
That's basically Riccardo Patrese' F1 career.
Pretty much, yes.
So Ferrari did have something of an advantage when they were doing that kind of mileage. Not year on year, of course, but over the course of many years, the testing helped them. And so they tried to change the testing period, which meant that we had lots of Friday test drivers. We had some interesting people came in. If I'm not mistaken, that's it. Satoshi Motoyama came in as well for some rounds, as well as Alan McNish. Frank Montagny, famous for his cocaine exploits in Formula E, came in. You had more what became the normality of the mid-late 2000s of Friday test driving, which is they're also bringing back these days. They're trying to force teams to have at least one or two sessions where they bring in other drivers, and I think that's a great thing. But they really should give more time to as many more drivers as possible because it's such a closed circuit.
Fully agreed. Both obviously in the terms of self-interest, because a Friday drive can become a race drive, which can become a one-off thing, which can become a GP rejects profile, but just generally in the nature of the sport, especially with the super light point systems now, which I don't want to complain, but is closing off F1, as you have said. So yeah, any more opportunities are always welcome, and it was undoubtedly one of the great introductions of 2003.
Yeah, there were lots of things done to basically stop Schumacher winning, and for the most part, they actually worked pretty well. Schumacher had up and down season. He had some of his greatest wins. For example, I think Austria, I rank among his best ever wins. I remember he had an issue in the pit lane, if I'm not mistaken. It was he had to do a double pit stop for some kind of fuel issue, I think. And I remember he did, in the last 15, 20 laps or so of that race, he put in like lap record after lap record after lap record. Like he was still at the top of his game, but he didn't have a perfect season. Yeah, and Suzuka especially must. I was gonna say it must be one of his worst season closers, but with Michael Schumacher, funnily enough, that's actually debatable, because he had a couple of should we say last round stinkers in his career for obvious reasons. But I don't know. Do you have anything more to say about Schumacher?
Well, obviously, if you're talking about his great drives, we can't possibly ignore the Indianapolis race, where he was just masterclass in the weather. And one thing I personally very much admire is the San Marino Grand Prix, where he went out despite the fact that he pretty much visited his dying mother in the night before, and still got, if I recall, a rather controlling W, which is a tremendous mental strength, and again, just it's very impressive, to say the very least. Well, and in some races he obviously was a bit silly, like Malaysia's one race that obviously comes to mind.
Yeah, just he had the similar crash to actually what Raikkonen had actually in Germany.
Yeah, and of course sometimes Ferrari let him down. But obviously, before we go to that, I just have to agree with Japan being a very messy event. The Nürburgring one where he had himself pushed out of the gravel trap is... But it saved him a couple of valuable points when Raikkonen's motor exploded. So that's that. The thing is, so in some cases also Ferrari let him down. Like if you take what I mentioned earlier, Australia, where part of the skirt fell off the car, and not even because he did anything, but just fell off, wasn't properly attached for whatever reason, or had come loose. And obviously that forced him into another pit stop. And there was the German Grand Prix where he was jolly well set to take 8 points for himself before his Bridgestone tire gave up on him, which Ron Dennis attributed to the fact that Ferrari had kept him out for too long. Obviously, that's Ron Dennis saying it, so it's not that I don't believe him, but obviously he said it was part of McLaren's strategy to push Ferrari to do that, so yeah.
It's also quite humorously ironic when you consider that Lewis Hamilton lost a championship due to being kept out too long.
And of course,
probably on Bridgestone tires, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and of course, if we're talking about McLaren and tires, who could forget the 2005 European Grand Prix?
Indeed. So I'll take what Dennis says with a pinch of salt.
Exactly. That is why I said, why I fully agree. Take it with a pinch of salt. You don't have to disbelieve him, but yeah, just keep the context in mind, I'd say.
So yeah, a mixed season for Michael Schumacher. I was going to say that you're right with the story of his and obviously Ralph Schumacher's mother dying. I think was also one of the things that attributed to him that, I don't know, maybe it's more of an international thing, but or maybe it's just a British press thing, that Michael Schumacher kind of had the reputation of being like an unfeeling robot kind of thing, and I think that's part of the mystique comes from the fact that he had such good mental fortitude to do what he did in spite of basically anything. He was it's almost superhuman for that reason, but that's coming from a fan, so I will shut up.
No, it's actually a very valid point, especially once you take account the cultural difference. Like for many Germans, especially because back when he was a star, he kind of still is a star, but you get the point. RTL's, as in the German television channel, coverage was a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff with Michael. Like the German audience always had a very different picture to every other audience, simply because we got fed so much Schumacher, because the hype was unreal. Like if you think the whole Max deal in the Netherlands is something, Michael's, especially the early hype in the actual 90s, can easily hang with that. So yeah, it's just that we don't have the quite the machine-like image, but we also had this, but we were also just as aware that, well, Michael could be a bit, how do I put it, ruthless in his approach. So I think so I think it actually serves to connect him to the normal citizen with that trouble, so to speak, even in Germany. So yeah, I don't think that was going anywhere, but
no, it's an interesting topic, and I think we could bring it up on another podcast as well. Like I think Nico Rosberg is another example whereby everything I've understood, I'm not German, I can only speak from one side of the conversation, but I've always heard that Rosberg, who was very polite and very smiley to the British press, was always trying to portray himself as, oh, I'm the nice one, and Hamilton is the serious one, and I'm the nice one. I'm not the grumpy one. But to the German press, he was like, oh no, I'm the best. I'm gonna kick Hamilton's arse. Yada yada yada. I'm bullish and I'm serious. So he was very much portraying two different sides of himself to different presses, because he knew what he needed to do for both sides, for both of those audiences.
Yeah,
which I found was quite interesting.
I mean, especially someone as internationally aligned as Rosberg, like. Exactly. The man speaks like 5 languages, 6 languages.
None of them is Finnish.
So he must have had this undeniable awareness of how he was also perceived in different markets. But it's not a coincidence that the man, after he retired, became is he a successful YouTuber, or would you? I am not quite sure. I'm not so into that YouTube side, so you probably know better whether he's successful or
The
not.
YouTubes and the TikToks and the Friends Reunited and the I think he is a semi-successful YouTuber. I mean, I used to watch him when he was actually racing. He used to do like post-race diaries and stuff. But just calling him a YouTuber would put him on the same level as us. So I don't know how to judge his internet.
But
career.
as Jeremy said, I'm old, so I am not the one to talk about successful YouTubers or lack thereof. So.
Yeah. After this, I'm going to update my MySpace and
And for the record,
chat to my friends on Bebo.
If you are curious, I was actually not in the paddock at the time, because that was before they invited kids to the paddock just because their favorite driver crashed down and they cried on live TV like that one Kenny kid. So they didn't ask 12-year-old me to come to the pit lane, regrettably.
Oh. Saddest story. Saddest story of the podcast, surely. Race stewards for Reject of the Year.
It is a catastrophe. But
one more thing which I guess we could keep with Ferrari. Rubens Barrichello, Michael Schumacher's teammate at Ferrari, of course. He was very, very critical at the beginning of the season and most of the leading up to it of the Hans device. The Hans device is, you'll probably notice it next time if you don't know it exists, you'll see it next time after I mention this. So when the drivers take off and put on their helmets, they have this almost like harness which goes up behind their head and on their shoulders. That was voluntary for many, many years. Usually it was put in especially after the death of Roland Ratzenberger, whose neck was broken when he died. And it was made to basically protect the necks of F1 drivers. And it's interesting that nowadays we have safety measures which are very heavily enforced. But in those days, for example, Barrichello didn't want to wear the Hans device because he didn't think it was comfortable, he didn't think it would do anything, this kind of thing. And it's interesting that, especially in those days, drivers were much more vocal, I would say, against things being imposed on them. Whereas nowadays, I think, especially with the Halo, I think it was pretty much unanimous. Everyone just kind of went that, I don't particularly have an opinion on it, but like they probably many of them did and still do. But back then, Barrichello, somewhat interestingly, was very against the Hans device, which has now been mandatory since 2003 on all drivers.
Yeah, the thing is, he was actually not the only one. Jacques Villeneuve was also a very vocal critic, so he mostly had made his peace with it by the time it became mandatory. But if you look at interviews from 2001, 2002, he was rather not in favor of it, which, let's just say, was unusual, to say the very least, because the popularity of the Hans device in racing circuits and with racing fans had increased massively, because it became clear after the incident that it could have, at the very least, if not outright, well, how do I put this best? It could have possibly saved Dale Earnhardt's life, which obviously was quite a big tragedy for NASCAR and obviously spread throughout the entire racing world. So, yeah, it was but yeah, it is very interesting to see the comparison, because in many ways, especially someone like Rubens, who actually had lived through the last fatalities in Formula One, as in Ratzenberger and Senna. But I think it's part of, at the time, many old racing driver myths and types were still very much in place that aren't quite there anymore. Like, there were still active memories of guys like James Hunt and, well, obviously Senna himself, who had
the fearless F1 drivers.
Exactly,
who
the reckless,
don't need no help.
The reckless, no today, no tomorrow, only today, no tomorrow is what I meant, driver, who lived fast and died young and partied hard and whatever. So I would imagine this is one of those generational shifts that hadn't quite sunk in by 2003, but obviously would come to pass once the current generation of drivers grew up with the more professional in terms of approach and attitude to safety. And someone like Michael Schumacher was always very vocal about this topic. regardless of his own stunts sometimes.
Yeah. It's also probably not a coincidence that Barrichello and Villeneuve, as you say, were the ones who were complaining, because they complained about everything. There wasn't a subject. There wasn't a subject which Barrichello and Villeneuve didn't have a negative opinion on.
Yeah, they are very. They would fit in very well with us. Let's put it that way. Consider that an invitation, Jack.
Yeah, if you're listening, you can have another one episode cameo, just as he seems to do with every series on the planet. He can join GP Rejects for a day on our podcast. But
you can even pick the topic.
What would Jacques Villeneuve pick as a topic? Okay, let's not get too off topic here.
Well, we can quickly discuss this, and we can see whether it's long enough we can cut it. I'd say he would probably, given as I think he would still want to go with the general gist of it, maybe his last year BAR, though it would be actually tying into 2003, spoilers, it would be a bit more negative about the team than we probably are going to be.
Yeah, like if we could talk to Jacques Villeneuve, I would love to hear his opinion on the best F1 game which didn't have the rights to use his name.
That's a good one. And I think he would actually be on board with that. Given as he was known to use Formula 1 simulators long before they became an organized and professional thing, so...
Oh, I'd love to hear his opinions on music. I'd love to hear his top 10 albums, his favorite songs to play.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting, though. It would be one of those podcasts. Well, let's just say it would be then more you and him, because I am not the music guy.
Neither is he.
Well, anyway, back to, on the topic of complaining, back to Rubens Barrichello.
Yeah, Rubens Barrichello won 2 races in 2003. He had a very Barrichello season. He was there for the final race to basically make sure that Schumacher won when Schumacher decided to make a pig's ear of Suzuka. And his other win came at the very mysterious British Grand Prix, where a crazy man, who I won't do justice by going into any more detail on, ran out into the middle of the track mid-race, caused, if I remember, only a safety car, got punted off by a marshal. The race resumed. It was absolutely crazy because all the pits were changed, all the strategies were changed last minute. Basically, the whole race restarted. And Barrichello won, just as he had done in the German Grand Prix in 2000, when someone else walked on track, which has obviously led to the wonderful conspiracy theory that Rubens Barrichello paid people to walk onto track to allow him to win.
If I had known that, well, let's just say I would have gotten arrested a few times in 2009.
Nice.
If you allow me the very quick side note, it's always amazing how generally there are exceptions. It always seems like stewards and the likes are surprisingly good at catching catching fans or other people who run onto the field. Like, there are a couple of streakers that got very far into things, but generally they get caught off ridiculously easy. I think he ran for, what was it? It can't have been more than 50 or 20 seconds, which is why I presume they didn't bother throwing a red flag, because they had pretty much taken him down by then. And for example, if you take a look at the pseudo sport of professional wrestling, anyone running into the ring gets pretty much destroyed by the referee in that ring, let alone the actual wrestlers getting at him. So I wonder whether they practice that.
Yeah, they must do, sure. That has to be
it sounds so
part of the martial training.
Like, it sounds so silly. Like, okay, guys, today we're going to practice a 1 in a million situation when some idiot ran out onto the track and how to take him best down. But
at Silverstone, they could just do like, "Oh, lads, we're gonna play a game of rugby for no reason."
We should write to Silverstone and ask them about that.
That's a good question. I might just do that. So Jacques Villeneuve had a bit of a stinker in 2003. He was driving in his last season for BAR, a team which he and Craig Pollock and Dave Richards was the other guy's name, formed together as basically the Jacques Villeneuve passion project, super happy go-go bonanza team, with the aim of winning world championships, which did not in the end succeed.
Well, more precisely, the project to rub one in on Michael Schumacher's face, like I can do anything better than you, which evidently he could not.
Yes, Villeneuve did like to, well, Villeneuve has said a lot of things over his career, but in the context of the late 90s and early 2000s, he did try to promote himself as the heir to Schumacher quite heavily. And he never had another shot at the title after 97. His Williams cars his Williams 98 was not championship capable, and his BARs were at best midfield. 2001 was pretty decent, but they started to drop off. And as they dropped off, so did Villeneuve. He had this changing guard at the team whereby, whereas originally it had been about him, the original key personnel moved out, time moved on, and suddenly he was no longer the golden boy who could do no wrong. Suddenly he had a teammate in Jenson Button who, depending on who you spoke to, was kind of rated, kind of not. He had his up and downs, and he basically thrashed Villeneuve. Villeneuve, feeling threatened by this, decided to make very loud, brash comments about the fact that Button had, to quote, a superior strategy to him when he just got soundly beaten. For example, he started complaining that Button was conspiring against him, the team was conspiring because they were British, yada 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 yada. It's the usual things that happens just before someone gets kicked out of a team, and that's what happened. So Villeneuve, in spite of being the golden boy who helped form BAR, was fired by his own team before the last race of 2003.
Yeah, it's this silly lashing out of a driver who knows he's not going to be there for long. One name that springs to mind to link this to one of your profiles would be Joyland Palmer. And even though the funny thing is, it's not even true, especially in the early part of the season. Like we're talking about the 2003 Australian Grand Prix, BAR tried double stacking him and Button, but the thing is, Villeneuve was ahead, but not far enough ahead to the point that double stacking actually worked. So they actively, in a way, unintentionally screwed Button out of his race to make sure Villeneuve got onto the dry tires quickly. So it's just rubbish, his claim. And one interesting fact: Villeneuve scored his last points for BAR at the Italian Grand Prix. Before that period, his last points were at the 2003 Brazilian Grand Prix. For those,
that's quite a gap.
Indeed, 10 races in total. And during that period, Jenson Button scored an 8th place, a 4th place, a 7th place, another 8th place, and another 8th place.
Yeah.
If
doesn't
you
really reflect so well on Villeneuve, does it?
If you take out all the points Button scored before and after that period, which admittedly are only 2. Oh, wait, actually, I'm wrong. It's
2. Yeah, you're
no,
right.
it's actually 7, because he had a 4th at Japan.
Oh, sorry, I thought you meant two different positions. Sorry.
Yeah, and then, but I was confused myself because I had to think about how many points were 4th again worth back then. But even if you take out those points, he still has more than Jack. So,
yeah, if you have to mathematically mess around stuff to try to make it look more equal, and he's still ahead, then yeah. Button had probably, I was going to say, the comeback of his career, but no, he had about 6 of those. But that was probably one of the first big comeback years that Button had, where he kind of saved his reputation a little bit by basically destroying the 1997 world champion. And Villeneuve, although his stock with the public definitely fell over this period, he was still rated as a racing driver. Like, he was still obviously a very good racing driver. No one wins a world championship without being semi-decent.
yeah.
And yeah, he collapsed his entire career, and it never really recovered after that. He had a very brief role in Renault after Trulli got fired from 2004, and a very bizarre comeback to Sauber which again he got fired from. Villeneuve's 2003 is basically the nosedive for Villeneuve's career.
Though obviously
which never really covered.
It must be noted, obviously, for GP Rejects that he totally would have had a career resurgence had Stefan become a thing, but
That's true, Stefan GP. Yes, he was he was I think the first signing for the team, and it's a very, very sad tragedy that it never materialized beyond a website.
But we will certainly go into that in the 2010 retrospective that is coming somewhere between now and the Heat Death of the Universe.
Yes, indeed. Where should we go next?
Well, or do you have?
Yeah.
If you have an idea, go ahead.
Antonio Pizzonia, I was thinking.
Oh,
speaking of people who had terrible
beautiful.
seasons.
Yeah. Though it should be noted, in the interest of fairness, he didn't help himself, but Jaguar also didn't help him. The thing is, rumors about his replacement came as far as Spain, as in the 5th race of the season. There were serious talks about whether Alexander Wurz would be in the Jaguar from Austria onwards. Like, as in, Ron Dennis was talking about that possible deal to the media already. And when you have, when you get so undercut, even though you have performed badly, no saving it, and obviously he would end up being replaced by Minardi driver Justin Wilson later down the road, but it's just what a mess that marriage was from day one, pretty much.
Yeah, Antonio Pizzonia is a bit of a bizarre driver in retrospect because he drove for 2 stints for Williams, which I think are probably even more well known than his Jaguar stint. But overall, like, he always seems like a piece in the jigsaw which fits, but it doesn't feel like it should. Like, it almost accidentally fits into Formula One. He had a very glittering junior career, and I would say that his most iconic moment in 2003 was actually off the track, because he crashed a lot. He was quite incident prone, and he got some prototype Jaguar thing to drive around a member of the press for, as these drivers do, they have to do their marketing and they have to do their things to the press. And he was driving around before the Spanish Grand Prix at full blast in this prototype, not thinking that he was just doing a demonstration run, and flipped it at the first corner because he was going so quickly, and almost injured both himself and the member of the press in front of the Jaguar staff who had all come, including, if I'm not mistaken, one of the top representatives of Ford. Or was it Ford, or was it no, sorry, not Ford, but it was one of the top representatives of Jaguar, and basically the whole head honchos were all there, and he flipped like the show car. So it wasn't even the F1 car, it was just some Jaguar. And it must be one of the most embarrassing things any F1 driver has done in recent history. Like, it doesn't get more embarrassing than that for many people. So I just think that in hindsight, Pizzonia wasn't very good. It's very easy for me sitting in a chair to say that, but he had a very, very heavily hyped pre-F1 career which just did not materialize. And not only did it not materialize, but he just flopped majorly. And his first season of Formula One, he didn't even make it to the end. He got replaced by Justin Wilson, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Yeah, and from there, he was only ever seen again when Ralf Schumacher had his yearly injury.
We'll get to that.
Unless you have anything to say about Pizzonia, we can go straight to that.
No, I actually don't. It's just, as you said, didn't pan out. Happens. We talked earlier about how Fernando Alonso lived up to the hype, and Pizzonia, well, he did not. But before we go to Ralph, let's go to Ralph, as in Firman, because actually I want to talk about Ralph Firman. Crazy as it sounds.
Please do.
The thing is, because Firman in itself hasn't had a very interesting season, but I was thinking about it while watching him race, and there's this type of driver, that type of reject that comes into Formula One, not with too much hype, not with too little hype, just a competent young driver. And he does actually quite good. But we get to the point where, or he's in a situation where he is good, but not good enough to draw attention. And Ralph Firman is the kind of reject, if we ever get to his profile, where we can talk for hours about how he was actually good enough for Formula One. He was ranked ahead of Fisichella in the F1Rejects.com ranking, and I fully agree with that after what I saw of him. He was one of those drivers that were good enough, but also not noticeable enough, or not, well, how do I put it? He was not the kind of driver that gave the impression that, wow, I gotta sign this guy at any cost. And I found that very interesting as I rewatched the races in preparation of this podcast. Just hey, this guy is actually pretty good. I wonder why he never got stuck around beyond that one season. And it's just, yeah, sometimes it is something we stress in our About page, that being a reject in itself is not a statement on your quality as a driver or lack thereof. And Ralph Firman is one of those wonderful examples of that. And I just thought that it was so fascinating that I wanted to get it out before we forget about it.
No, I'm happy you did. Firman, if we could consider this a very, very mini profile on this podcast, he had what many F1 rejects don't, which was options. He had spent many years in Japan, and after he left Formula One, he went back there. He did Super GT for many years. Before that, he'd actually won Formula Nippon, which in those days at least was very, very highly rated in terms of quote junior formula. It wasn't a junior formula to Formula One, but lots of F1 drivers, Ralf Schumacher for example, springboarded from there to Formula One. And I think that Firman, who from his perspective probably didn't have the highest number of options to go forward in Formula One, and from there it makes sense that he went back to Japan if he had that option, because winning in one series is better than maybe sitting at the back of the grid on another.
Yeah.
But Piercarlo Genzani would disagree with that. But
and another driver probably would
wouldn't.
In this very season. We'll get that. That was the seventh
Who would
time.
that be?
That would be Heinz-Harald Frentzen.
Yes, Heinz-Harald Frentzen. He is one of many drivers, actually, including in some ways Villeneuve, but in technical terms, also Jos Verstappen as well, who were in their swan song seasons, who were pretty big in the 90s. They were, if Jos Verstappen wasn't a front runner, Frentzen certainly was up and down in that, especially in the late 90s. But his 2003 was not the best. He had a really good podium in the US, where he kept it on track. He had a better strategy. He just had a really good race overall. But other than that, 2003 was very patchy for him.
Yeah, the thing is, Sauber generally had not a very good year. If you look at Nick Heidfeld's results, they weren't particularly impressive either. But the thing is, and this is something where I actually went beyond the mere ranking in the F1 Rejects review, and they went very harsh on him in terms of his drive towards succeeding in Formula One, and they talked critically about him being complacent, where he said he was, I don't recall which race it was, let me see whether I can make it out from the results. No, I can't. But he was very far down the order from qualifying onwards and never got anywhere, and said, oh yeah, I had fun, and they absolutely hated that. Because it lacked the serious drive, and as they said in their projection for 2004, that someone like Frentzen should make room for the young ones, and eventually that's what they ended up doing, whether voluntarily or not, and he ended up driving for Opel in DTM the season afterwards. So
it's very different to how we view Hulkenberg and well, maybe not Hulkenberg, but at least Alonso, in terms of old people hanging around.
The thing is, I don't want to take away from a later part, because I will address that when we get to the inevitable rejects of the year podiums we're going to make up for this season.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but I just think it's interesting because like we think it's quite positive when someone like Alonso enjoys himself. At least I do. I'm speaking for, I just said we, but I enjoy it. When Alonso enjoys himself and he's like he's in Formula One because he wants to be, and people are hiring him and he wants to be there. And Hulkenberg is the same. He wants to be there and he's determined to be there, and people will hire him. So like, if Frentzen was the same, I have no issue with that.
Yeah.
if he's rubbish, then maybe it's a problem. But
yeah, the thing is, I actually have gone a bit back and forth on this topic, which is again why I'm going to address it later. So, yeah.
All right, let's not address it then.
We get to
where should we go from here?
Yeah, we were originally planning to go with the slightly more famous Ralph, and so we'll do that.
Sure.
Ralf Schumacher.
Okay.
And do you want?
Ralf Schumacher. I don't have very many strong opinions of him in 2003 in particular, but it was probably the last season in which he really. It was probably the last of his golden age of seasons, because Ralf Schumacher 1999 especially. 1999 Ralf Schumacher is probably his best season, and 2001 as well. He had a very good collection of seasons at Williams, and I think 2003 was probably the last one. From there, his career, well, he never hit those heights again. 2003, I don't have very many strong opinions. I think he didn't beat Montoya. I think Montoya was, for probably the first time between them, quite clearly the better driver that year. It wasn't always that way. They were pretty evenly matched. I don't have very... Do you have any strong opinions about Ralf Schumacher's 2003?
Actually, I do, because I agree partly. It was the last of his golden season, but the thing is, even the golden part was very limited. In particular, from the period to Monza to say... Well, you can include Germany. Well, actually, yes, Germany is very much where I draw the line, because especially early in the season, he had begun his development into the kind of driver that he would become in the years afterwards. I'm there, I'm good, I'm getting paid a whole ton of money, but I am not doing anything special. Like the Sergio Perez role, if you want to force a current analogy onto Ralph. The thing is where he is good, where he can win races, but there clearly is the reality: this man is not this man will not win a Formula One World Championship as he is ever.
Yes.
Again, if he had done before, but yeah, this man isn't winning championships anymore, and that is something that had pretty much taken place before the start of 2003. His early races in particular were okay, but also not helped by the fact that the Williams wasn't really that good to start the year. But in the end, he was solid to good, but not great. And that is where we get to the difference between good and great. That is the difference between champions and not champions. And Ralph had pretty much metamorphed into the good driver. Particular races like, again, I'm bringing it up. I have brought it up like 5 times. The 2003 Spanish Grand Prix, where he just struggled mightily. So many lockups. I don't think I have seen as many lockups from a driver in a race since my own R-Factor races.
Or my own as well, yeah. I was going to say.
The thing is, yeah, he had this one glory period where he couldn't quite beat Michael to the flag in Canada, and then won back-to-back races within 7 days, which would be his last Formula One wins, in fact. But at that point, the conceptual idea of Ralf Schumacher, Formula One world champion, was dead.
Yep, that's fair. Yeah, I agree with all that. It was his last good season, and it wasn't a great season. And from there, 2004, they obviously had the shark nose, or whatever it was called, the bull nose.
Velros.
Yeah, Williams, and their relationship soured pretty quickly, and again, it was definitely a changing of the guard, especially when you consider we started off this podcast with talking about Kimi Räikkönen and Fernando Alonso. Schumacher, Ralph in that case, was one of the old guard who was moving aside, although he was only in his late 20s. It wasn't like he was an old man. If I'm mistaken, he was 28, 29. So he wasn't very, very old that he was moving aside. But
yeah,
his
but
best
it was
years were definitely behind him.
But it was his 7th season, and back in those days, if you made it to 8 seasons period, you were already good, and if you made it to 10, you were even greater. And what was he? Would he end up with? If he says this was 7, 11. Yeah, which was a pretty good career back then.
Yeah, but yeah, Ralph didn't. When the time came in 2001 where Williams finally could win a championship, because they genuinely could, they could have. Ralph wasn't the one to lead him. It was, in fact, his teammate, Juan Pablo Montoya, who I would love to talk about.
Please do.
Montoya. If ever there was a great driver who didn't win a world championship, it was Juan Pablo Montoya. 2003 was a good season for many reasons. However, it wasn't a great season for, if you want to say a great season for it is a weird way of saying it, but it wasn't a great season for crashes. And it was of a period of time when overtaking was limited. Early 2000s were not a golden age for overtakes. However, if there was one driver who used to overtake a lot in that period of time, it was Juan Pablo Montoya. He seemed to buck the trend that overtaking wasn't possible in Formula One. He was easily, in my opinion, the most exciting driver of 2003. He won the Monaco Grand Prix in incredible circumstances. In fact, just him winning the Monaco Grand Prix just makes me smile. He was a passionate person in a Formula One which was depressingly robotic and market-oriented. And his 2003 was his best season. He had a patchy career as well. His golden period basically kind of ended after 2003 as well. But damn, the flame looked good when it burned, didn't it? I would personally put Montoya as my driver of the year for 2003. If just for expectations, if just for how he looked on track, and if just for how happy it makes me to have seen him do so well.
Yeah, that is a perfectly valid choice, and certainly no one can argue against it. The thing with Montoya is, and this is where I feel he in a way lost the championship. Like, if you look, in particular, if you look at Michael almost made an art form of salvaging something out of his horrible races, and Kimi managed to do it 1 or 2 times as well. But the thing is, when Montoya's race went sideways, it didn't happen very often. Like, there were, let me quickly check, 7 races where he wasn't on the podium.
Well, look who's here! Hi!
Lennart,
You look like you've got something to say. Do you?
Yes, I certainly do. I have to go now. My planet needs me.
Wow,
Lennart.
came from another planet? I guess.
Hey, that wasn't supposed to happen.